This is the youngest country in the world, South Sudan. It gained its independence on July 9th, 2011, which is the same year the iPad 2 released. So this begs the question, how, and more importantly why, did this country gain its independence less than 20 years ago? Well, unlike what you might expect, it didn't start with the British, although they certainly played a role. To understand their desire for independence, we need to understand the many differences between South Sudan and its larger neighbor. And to do that, we need to understand the history of South Sudan and its people. The earliest mention of South Sudan is by the Romans, who were trying to find the source of the Nile. They couldn't get past the Sud marshes, which is an area of extreme marshlands in the center of the country. Spreading from these marshlands, the nomadic people began to spread to the rest of South Sudan. They had mostly replaced the previous Central Sudanic people by the mid-1500s. The first major kingdom in what was now South Sudan was the Shilluk Kingdom, whose origins date to around 1490. The king that was supposedly half crocodile and could control the rain, the kingdom gained power quickly, and had widespread use of agriculture as compared to their earlier, more pastoral customs. By the 1600s, it had a similar population density to Egypt. During all of this, other nomadic groups remained in the Sud marshes. The Shilluk persistently had conflict with the nearby Fuji Sultanate, as they were on the other side of the Nile. Around 1630, the Shilluk invaded Fuji with the help of the Kingdom of Takali and the Sultanate of Darfur. They eventually won the conflict, and the Shilluk gained control of the area around the White Nile. In 1821, the Fuji Sultanate completely collapsed after an invasion by the Ottoman governor of Egypt, Muhammad Ali. This was quite bad for the Shilluk kingdom, as they were next on the chopping block. The Ottomans invaded the region and even penetrated into the Sud marshes. Yet, due to a myriad of factors, the most prominent of which being disease, the Ottomans couldn't really put troops down and control the area, which left a power vacuum that was filled by the merchant Al-Zubayr Rahma Mansur. Mansur hired a private army and took control of the Bahr el-Ghazal region. The source of his strength was trade, and to secure it, he set up small trading forts to sell ivory and, unfortunately, slaves. Concerned with the growing power of Mansur, Ottoman Khedive, or governor of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, tried to oust Al-Zubayr twice, and failed twice. First, he tried sending a British explorer with a small army, and then second, he tried sending mercenary leader Muhammad al-Buwawi. Eventually, Ismail gave up and appointed him governor in 1873. In 1877, Ismail's replacement, Charles Gordon, managed to oust Al-Zubayr, but once again faced the same problems as early Ottoman settlements and struggled to maintain control of the region. Faced with British pressure, the Egyptians agreed to co-rule the territory of Sudan. The British decided that due to the differences between North and South, they would be ruled differently. This was made official in 1930, but less than 20 years later, the British would begin to treat Sudan as one entity again. This angered the South Sudanese, who saw this as an attack on their autonomy. But this didn't change much for a while, as all of Sudan was ultimately ruled by the British Empire. Yet, that would change when Sudan gained its independence in 1956. Now, South Sudan would be ruled from Khartoum. Now, I haven't mentioned it yet, because it hasn't been very important until now, but in addition to their historical and ethnic differences, there are religious ones as well. South Sudan is majority Christian, while Sudan is 97% Muslim. These differences will be brought to the forefront as a result of Sudan's independence. Southern leaders feared that the interests of Southern Sudan would be completely overpowered by the North, so they took action, starting with a small mutiny in 1955, a few months before independence, and slowly growing larger. Eventually, in 1963, they formed the guerrilla army Anyana, which means snake venom in the Mahdi language. The civil war lasted for more than a decade, until the Addis Ababa Agreement was signed in 1972, which granted South Sudan much more autonomy. The peace created by the Addis Ababa Agreement lasted for only 11 years, when Sudanese President Ghaffar Nimeri declared Sudan an Islamist state under Sharia law and abolished South Sudan's autonomy. To put it quite plainly, this was a really bad idea. This wasn't tolerated by the South Sudanese, who started the Second Sudanese Civil War in 1983. Having learned from the First War, they were much more organized the second time around, and set up the Sudan People's Liberation Army, or SPLA. But unfortunately, this unity would not last, as several factions split from the SPLA due to ethnic differences. Several of these actually allied with the Sudanese government. In fact, more South Sudanese died fighting each other than the North. This civil war continued for more than 20 years, until in 2005, both sides signed the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. I sure hope it was comprehensive after almost 30 years of war and at least 2 million dead. The peace agreement, among other things, agreed to give South Sudan more autonomy, and, more importantly for our story, agreed that South Sudan would have an independence referendum in 6 years. Thankfully, the peace agreement went well, at least compared to last time. South Sudan had its independence referendum in 2011, which would pass with an astonishingly high 98%, and a turnout of over 99%, which honestly seems too high. I mean, when can you get 99% of people to show up for anything? And, in fact, several regions had over 100% turnout. But, regardless, both sides agreed that secession won out. South Sudan became an independent country on July 9, 2011. Yet, even free, they still faced many issues. In 2012, Sudan's Air Force bombed regions of South Sudan, and in response, South Sudan seized the high-gig oil fields, but they were later pushed back by Sudan. Besides external conflicts, South Sudan has had many internal issues to deal with as well, such as a civil war between 2013 and 2020, in which the government of South Sudan fought against many insurgent groups. This civil war killed over 300,000 people and displaced up to 2 million. Which brings us to the present. Even now, South Sudan has many issues holding it back, such as ethnic conflicts, poverty, and ongoing tensions with Sudan. Not to be too naively optimistic, but I hope they'll be able to overcome these differences and take advantage of their many strengths, such as large oil reserves, which could provide the government with more money to build infrastructure, and with their control of the White Nile, they could dam the river to gain electricity and use that electricity to develop. Hopefully in a decade's time, I'll be able to make a video about the incredible turnaround for South Sudan.